And Laura Coates, you're a legal analyst, former federal prosecutor. When you look at the meetings, Laura, when you look at the denials, what does it tell you?
It tells me that where you have secrecy, it will breed suspicion, and that's what's happening right now. The reason people have turned their attention to these is not because we have the ultimate conclusion. We're in the very kind of initial stages of an investigation as to what was the influence of Russia, if any, what was the involvement of key campaign staffers and perhaps surrogates. But when you have people who are a little bit mischievous in their response or misleading, it makes you raise an eyebrow. And it really reminds me as a federal prosecutor when you ask somebody a question and they have amnesia and they can't really recall, then you threaten them and say, you have an oath, perjury could be a consequence of it, and they have a great memory of what's just happened. That leads to further suspicion, and it makes people say, we need to make sure that the investigation that's currently underway, if it's really happening, is being led by somebody who's objective and could actually monitor appropriately.
Phil Mudd, these meetings, how typical or atypical do they seem to be to you?
Look, on the surface, I don't view these as particularly significant. Let me tell you why. Let's say the Trump team comes into office after the inauguration, and somebody says, what do you think Russia thinks about Syria? What do they think about Europe and NATO? What do they think about steps forward with the Iran nuclear program and the deal with Iran? And the Trump team says, we were uncomfortable meeting with the Russians and the Russian ambassador, so we've got to start from ground zero. I, as a voter, Wolf, would not be comfortable with that story. I tell you, though, we're missing a key piece, and I hope over the next few days, Brian, Todd, and everybody else asks one question. Put this in perspective for me. Two ways to look at that. Number one, the Trump team met with the Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis, the Indonesians, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Mexicans, the Germans. I would step back and say, wow, Jeff Sessions, a couple meetings with the Russians, no big deal. That's what the campaign did. Conversely, Wolf, let's say we ask that perspective question and somebody says, wow, the only people they seem to have met with consistently weren't the Germans, weren't the British, they weren't the Chinese, they were the Russians. Depending on the context, Wolf, I think the answer to your question about how significant this is takes on different colors. So that's why I'm waiting for more answers.
And why deny those meetings over and over and over again if they're typical meetings that campaigns have with foreign leaders, with foreign ambassadors? Why repeatedly deny that they even took place? Now we know they did take place.
Well, let me take you inside Washington. I think one of the things that happened here wasn't necessarily lying. It was people who don't have a lot of experience in Washington and who started realizing that they were facing questions. They answered those questions tactically. They didn't go back and review their journals. They didn't go back and think seriously about what had happened at the convention months ago last summer. And they suffered death by 1,000 cuts when the Washington Post, CNN, and others started to reveal information. They never got in front of the story because I suspect their inexperience in Washington didn't lead them to get out in front of this and say, wow, before we answer another question, we ought to sit down and not let this go out piecemeal. We ought to let everything out the door. I don't think this is lies. Maybe in some circumstances it is. I think it's bad management at the White House.
What do you think, Abby?
I think that there's an element of bad management here, but I do think that most of the people involved have a lot of experience in Washington, principal among them, Jeff Sessions, who's a longtime senator and is also an attorney and understands what it means to answer a question or to over-answer a question, as he did in his Senate hearing. I think people like Sean Spicer in the White House, Reince Priebus, they understand how this works. They may have overlooked it in an effort to tamp down the questions, but the real solution here would have been to come clean at the very beginning, because, as Phil said, these meetings are not in and of themselves suspicious or in any way wrong necessarily, but not disclosing them is part of a pattern. And over the past couple of days, we've seen several meetings suddenly disclosed between the ambassador. That shouldn't be happening. They should have disclosed them early on to dispel any suspicion.
Laura, what should the White House now be doing to get ahead of this story?
They should be focusing on whether or not there's going to be a criminal investigation into the misstatement, keyword here, perhaps perjury, of Jeff Sessions. The issue is not just about whether or not we have an ultimate conclusion of Russian interference. That is a separate issue that may be investigated and may ultimately come to pass. But the issue right now is you have several people who are key members of the administration, most recently Flynn, and now we have Sessions, who are making false statements. And remember, the person who runs the Department of Justice is keenly aware of the responsibility of what it means to testify under oath. And don't don't give him a pass simply because he maybe had misunderstood the context that Senator Al Franken gave him. He also got the question in writing from Senator Patrick Leahy, which shows you there may be more of a pattern than you even believe. And so the recusal perhaps is the most prudent course, but what they have to focus on now is, listen, get your ducks in a row, because the Russia problem is not going anywhere.
Quickly to you, Phil, what do you think the White House needs to do right now?
Look, this is pretty basic. I agree with this. They cannot allow the media to own this story drip by drip, a drop of blood every day, as sharks in the Congress, the media, and among the American people rip a hole in them. They ought to get out in front and say, look, we've hired somebody. I'd suggest, I'll throw him under the bus, Robert Mueller, former FBI director. He has access to diaries, phone records, and interviews, and over the course of the next 30 days, he will interview everyone in the campaign, or at least most of the people, review their diaries and their phone records, and the White House doesn't let drops of blood go in the water. They dump a tub load of blood in the water and say, we will give you every answer you want and more. They are way behind the curve, and they're way too tactical.
The president responded today by tweeting about Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, making fun of them and the meetings they had with the Russian ambassador and with Putin on the part of Schumer himself.
Yeah, it seems to be helping to kind of muddy the waters around this a little bit, but it also illustrates an important thing, which is that Nancy Pelosi didn't remember that she'd had that meeting, or didn't think that it was appropriate in that context, which sort of helps their argument that maybe there's a reasonable expectation that Sessions could have been trying to do the right thing, but just simply made a mistake.
All right, guys, stick around. We've got more coming up.